Welcome to Wrestling with Heart, a podcast looking at pro wrestlers giving back to their community. Join me, Stanley Carr, as I interview wrestling's hottest names who use their platforms as entertainers to raise awareness and do community service. Hello and welcome to another edition of Wrestling with Heart. This is the show where we talk with professional wrestlers and professional wrestling personalities about their lives in and outside of the ring, as well as doing acts of community service, charity work, spreading positivity. We're always about the positive vibes here on the show, and I've got a very special guest with me. He is a professional wrestling referee, has refereed numerous matches over the course of 3 decades, just all over the U.S., especially the East Coast. He has got a book out, and we'll talk about that and so much more. I'm pleased to welcome the one and only David Dwinell. David, welcome to Wrestling with Heart.
Well, Stanley, thank you very much for having me as part of your show. And I have to say, probably the fans are saying Dave who? And, not actually a household name as far as wrestling is concerned. But if you go on YouTube, you'll see me in a number of matches from Madison Square Garden. And I did hang around the business for 32 years and have a lot of stories to share with you. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I grew up in a small mill town in central Massachusetts called Millbury.
Okay.
And everybody knew everybody, and everybody worked in a mill. There were 7 mills in town, including my dad. And um, one day he comes home around Christmas with a box with a cord attached to it, something he called a television set. This is about 1959, and there were 3 channels on, and they were boring. Except one day I found these 2 guys beating the crap out of each other in the middle of a ring, and I became fascinated. I said, "What am I watching?" And I knew it wasn't boxing; they didn't have gloves on. And then Ray Morgan, who was the announcer, it was from Capital, it was WWF from Capital Wrestling from Washington. And Ray Morgan says, and tune in next week for professional wrestling, more of your great stars. Well, I became a wrestling junkie at the age of probably around 11 or 12. And we didn't have internet in those days. We didn't have computers. We didn't have many shows. So in the summertime, we had to find things to do that was fun. So my brother and I would wrestle and pretend we had our own wrestling promotion on the front lawn, and we would pretend, we were like Antonino Rocca or many of the stars of that Chief Big Heart or whoever. Um, and I became kind of hooked. And then I went to my first show at the Worcester Memorial Auditorium, and on that show, Bruno Sammartino was the main event against Curtis Iakia. And after begging my mom to let us, I was a little older at that time, and begging my mom to let me go with my brother alone, we had front row seats. And believe it or not, we were some of the only kids in there. They were all blue collar workers back in the 60s, smoking, drinking. You could hardly see the ring. And I became really hooked on wrestling after having attended my first live event and seeing Bruno in action and seeing people like Johnny Rods and Arnold Skoland, Chief Big Heart, the Beast, people that probably most people have forgotten. So that's a little bit of my intro into my love with pro wrestling.
So this was like around the time of the territory days where you had like local promotions kind of running everything before they had big companies kind of take over, before the WWE became such a national juggernaut. And so you had like a lot of people just kind of go back and forth between each territory. The East Coast, especially up north where you were, just had so many stars passing by.
Well, they didn't fly in those days. So the East Coast had the opportunity to go from Washington, DC to Baltimore once a month. They'd go Washington every 6 weeks, maybe Washington, Baltimore, Philly, um, Madison Square Garden, White Plains, which is where I spent most of my life living in that area. Then they'd go up to Hartford. Then they go to Boston Garden. then they would go up to Maine, then they'd come back and start all over again. But they could drive, and so and obviously those arenas could pack people in as compared to somebody in the Midwest driving for hours and getting a smaller crowd. So we had a lot of the stars, and of course, the magazines in those days all came out of New York, so they favored people like Bruno. And but I knew there were other territories because I bought all the magazines and read in the back. The NWA had the it was in the back of actually boxing magazines in those days, and they'd have the NWA ratings. They'd have the AWA, they'd have the WWF. So I knew there were other territories around. So I was probably one of the few people that did, because most people in the East only knew of the major stars like Bruno and people of that nature.
Being a referee, I mean, you talk about being a wrestler, that's intense as in itself, but I'm sure being a referee has its fair share of headaches as well. What made you decide to go into that end of the business?
Well, I always, as I mentioned earlier, I always loved wrestling. However, I'm I had moved after college. I went to college in Cleveland, Ohio, and after college, I taught and coached up at a prep school in upper state New York, and then I moved down closer to the city, about a 35-minute train ride to Manhattan. And I was working at the Trade Center at the time. And Monday nights, I would watch wrestling from the Garden a couple times a month with a bunch of friends. We'd have a few brewskis and talk. And I'd say, "Gee, the ref's doing a terrible job." And they said, "What, you think he could do better?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." So the next day, I said, "You know what? Maybe I ought to look into this. Maybe I could become a referee. I know I'm never going to be a wrestler, but maybe I could become a ref." So my journey began. So I called. I couldn't find a number for the WWF, and I found Capital Wrestling finally through many phone calls to because there was no computers. I couldn't look it up. In those days, you were at the mercy of Ma Bell, a telephone company. So I got a number for Capital Wrestling, and I tried 28 times, and on the 29th time, this guy answers, and he sounded like he would make Marlon Brando and The Godfather sound like an angel. Goes, "Hello." I said, "Is this WWF?" He goes, "Who wants to know?" I said, "My name is Dave Dwinell. What do you want?" I said, "I'd like to be a referee." "We don't need any." I said, "All right." I said, "How about if I send you a resume?" "Don't send me any gifts, kid. I don't need to talk to you. Goodbye." Guy hangs up. I said, "Well, that went well." So I'm not ready to give up quite yet, because now I'm upset. I said, "You're not going to blow me off." So I looked up where their office was located. And I worked in the Trade Center at the time, and I found out it was up Midtown. So I go up, and it's the Holland Hotel. I'm going, "This is a little strange." So every day at lunchtime, I went to the Holland Hotel for like 2 or 3 weeks, hoping to find somebody from the WWF to talk to. So finally, after 2 or 3 weeks of spending an hour or so in front of the hotel, the doorman comes out and he says, "Excuse me, are you a cop, a private eye, Secret Service, or are you just a nut?" I go, "Well, I'm looking for somebody from the WWF." He goes, "They're only here a couple days a month." It was kind of a sham office. "They're only here a couple days a month when the garden's in town." But that's what they were using for their office address at the time. So I was pretty much ready to give up. And I was the MC at our 100th anniversary for our church. And I met a guy connected with the athletic commission who knew the ropes. And he said, "Look, it's political." So I got a couple politicians whom I knew to recommend me, and they sent me a license in the mail without a test, without ever having refereed. It was pretty much political. So they never let me work. They gave me a license, they didn't let me work. I said, "This is not going to work." So I found their office for the state was around the corner from the Trade Center. So I go over, and the guy was nice, and he says, "Oh, we'll call you shortly." Well, my definition of shortly was different than his, because 3 months went by. So finally I went over and started yelling at the guy, and the boss comes out, the chairman of the commission. And he says, "What's the problem?" And I said, "Look, you give me a license, you don't let me work." So he goes, "All right, we'll give you." He knew I was politically connected, so he says, "You're going to work." So about 2 weeks later, I get a call, and it says, "You're going to do a WWF show at the county center," which had about 5,000 people. And I said, "Great." And then it sank in. Whoa, I never talked to a wrestler. I have no idea if it's fake or real. There's going to be 5,000 people there. What if they don't like me? They're going to throw me out of the ring. I said, this could be a bit of a problem. So I went and I borrowed every VHS tape at Blockbuster Video. And I said, I
Blockbuster
think I can
Video.
do this. So I went over and I get over there. My friend Arnold Skolin sees me with my little bag. He says, Dave, you going on vacation? I said, no, I'm one of your reps. And he goes, no kidding. He goes, well, it's getting late. You better go up and talk to Johnny Rods. That's your first match. Johnny Rods and this new kid, 21-year-old Eddie Gilbert. So I said, all right. So I go up and I go, what do I? I'm walking up the stairs. The locker room's upstairs, and I'm going, what do I talk to Rods about? The weather? How's the family? Is wrestling fake? So I went in, and Rods was phenomenal. Johnny Rods was so great. He knew. He goes, first match. I go, yeah. How'd you know? He goes, I know. He goes, we all start someplace, kid. He says, let's talk about our match. He called it our match. And in the first match, he let me push him. I disqualified him. He pushed me. I pushed him. We started arguing, and I threatened to fine him $1,000 with the commission if he didn't shut up and get out of the ring. So he made me, and it put me greatly at ease. And that was the beginning of the wrestlers enjoyed working with me. I knew the sport. Some of the refs in New York weren't exactly into the sport. They thought it was boxing, and they disqualify a guy if they touched him. I understood the sport, so it started there and ended 32 years later.
Yeah, definitely there are some similarities between wrestling and boxing, but there are plenty of differences. And it's easy to pick up on those right away as you're watching and investing your time into the program and getting the chance to work with some of a who's who of people uh, over the course of your career. Talked about Johnny Rods, uh, heck of a guy.
This is Wrestling with Heart. I hope you found this podcast to be informative and entertaining. If you did, please hit the subscribe button and look out for the next edition.